Monsieur Terrien.
Madame Normandin. Monsieur Bergeron. Mr. St-John.
Mr. 𝐒𝐿𝐵.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. Blair.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Monsieur Duclos. Ms. Demar. Mr. Van Couverden. Mr. Fisher. Ms. O'Connell.
It being 3:10, pursuant to order made on Thursday, June 23rd, 2022, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the amendment of Mr. Calkins to the motion at third reading stage of Bill C-21. Convoquez les députés.
Call in the members.
La question est la suivante.
The question is as follows.
By Mrs. Fortier, moved that Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, firearms, be now read a third time and do pass. Monsieur Calkins, appuyé par...
Mr. Calkins, seconded by Mr. Bezan, moves that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following.
To amend certain acts and to make certain... May I dispense? No? Okay. Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, firearms, be not now read a third time, but be referred back to the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security for the purpose of reconsidering Clause 0.1, 1.1, and 17 for the view to ensure that the government cannot take away hunting rifles from law-abiding farmers, hunters, and Indigenous peoples. La période de...
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person.
In favor of the amendment will please rise.
Mr. Bezan.
Mr. Bezan.
Mr. 𝐒𝐿𝐵.
Mr. 𝐒𝐿𝐵.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Straw.
Ms. Dancho.
Ms. Dancho.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Ms. Findley.
Ms. Findley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mrs. Kramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Kramp-Nyman.
Ms. Ferreri.
Ms. Ferreri.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Lou.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mrs. Wagentall.
Mrs. Wagentall.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Monsieur d'Entremont.
Mr. d'Entremont.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dalton,
Mr. Dalton,
Mr. Bragdon,
Mr. Bragdon,
Mr. Soroka,
Mr. Soroka,
Mr. Ruff,
Mr. Ruff,
Mr. Shields,
Mr. Shields,
Mr. Fast,
Mr. Fast.
Que tous.
All those opposed to the amendment will please rise.
Mr. 𝐒𝐿𝐵,
Mr. 𝐒𝐿𝐵,
Mr. Blair,
Mr. Blair,
Ms. Bennett,
Ms. Bennett,
Monsieur Duclos,
Monsieur Duclos,
Ms. Tassi,
Ms. Tassi,
Madame Petitpas-Taylor,
Madame Petitpas-Taylor,
Monsieur 𝐒�R𝐵,
Monsieur 𝐒�R𝐵,
Ms. 𝐿𝐵,
Ms. 𝐿𝐵,
Mr. Casey,
Mr. Casey,
Ms. Cara,
Ms. Cara,
Monsieur 𝐒𝐿𝐵-𝐞𝐦𝐵,
Monsieur 𝐂𝐂𝐿𝐵-𝐞𝐦𝐵,
Monsieur Dubourg,
Monsieur Dubourg,
Madame Bendayan,
Madame Bendayan,
Ms. Demoff,
Ms. Demoff,
Monsieur Lauzon,
Monsieur Lauzon,
Mrs. Vandenbeld,
Mrs. Vandenbelt,
Madame Brière,
Madame Brière,
Mr. Biddle,
Mr. Biddle,
Mr. Fillmore,
Mr. Fillmore,
Mrs. Romanado,
Mrs. Romanado,
Mr. Lamoureux,
Mr. Lamoureux,
Ms. Sahoda,
Ms. Sahoda,
Mr. Varani,
Mr. Varani,
Monsieur Fergus,
Monsieur Fergus,
Mr. Oliphant,
Mr. Elephant,
Mr. Ananda Sangari,
Mr. Ananda Sangari,
Madame Koutrakis,
Madame Koutrakis,
Madame Lalonde,
Madame Lalonde,
Ms. Dillon,
Ms. Dillon,
Monsieur 𝐿𝐵,
Monsieur 𝐂𝐿𝐵,
Mr. Hardy,
Mr. Hardy,
Mr. Vancouverton,
Mr. Vancouverton,
Mr. Fisher,
Mr. Fisher,
Ms. O'Connell,
Ms. O'Connell,
Mr. May Cambridge,
Mr. May Cambridge,
Mr. Cedar Brampton East,
Mr. Cedar Brampton East,
Ms. Suds,
Ms. Suds,
Mr. Fragascatos,
Mr. Fragascatos,
Mr. Longfield,
Mr. Longfield,
Mr. Maloney,
Mr. Maloney,
Mr. McDonald Avalon,
Mr. McDonald Avalon,
Madame Shanahan,
Madame Shanahan,
Ms. Yip,
Ms. Yip,
Mr. Aldag,
Mr. Aldag,
Mr. Pulowski,
Mr. Pulowski,
Mr. Turnbull,
Mr. Turnbull,
Madame Mendez,
Madame Mendez,
Monsieur Zuberi,
Monsieur Zuberi,
Mr. Ali,
Mr. Ali,
Ms. Bradford,
Ms. Bradford,
Mr. Collins, Hamilton East, Stony Creek,
Mr. Collins, Hamilton East, Stony Creek,
Mr. Koto,
Mr. Koto,
Mr. Gahir,
Mr. Gahir,
Ms. Kayabaga,
Ms. Kayabaga,
Madame Lapointe,
Madame Lapointe,
Mr. Miao,
Mr. Miao,
Mrs. Valdez,
Mrs. Valdez,
Mr. Sousa,
Mr. Sousa,
Monsieur Terrien,
Monsieur Terrien,
Madame Normandin,
Madame Normandin,
Monsieur Bergeron,
Monsieur Bergeron,
Monsieur Garon,
Monsieur Garon,
Monsieur Desilets,
Monsieur Desilets,
Madame de Bellefeuille,
Madame de Bellefeuille,
Madame Michaud,
Madame Michaud,
Madame Vignola,
Madame Vignola,
Madame Gaudreau,
Madame Gaudreau,
Madame Larouche,
Madame Larouche,
Monsieur Perron,
Monsieur Perron,
Monsieur Barcelot-Duval,
Monsieur Barcelot Duval,
Monsieur Beaulieu,
Monsieur Beaulieu,
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés,
Madame Saint-Clair de Gagné,
Monsieur Trudel,
Monsieur Trudel,
Madame Desbiens,
Madame Desbiens,
Madame Bérubé,
Madame Bérubé,
Mr. Massey,
Mr. Massey,
Mr. Backrack,
Mr. Backrack,
Mr. Blakey,
Mr. Blakey,
Ms. Kwan,
Ms. Kwan,
Mr. Garrison,
Mr. Garrison,
Ms. Idlout,
Ms. Idlout,
Mr. Johns,
Mr. Johns,
Mr. McGregor,
Mr. McGregor,
Madame Hughes,
Madame Hughes,
Ms. Zarillo,
Ms. Zarillo,
Ms. Mathyssen,
Ms. Mathyssen,
Mr. Desjardins,
Mr. Desjardins,
Mr. Morris,
Mr. Morris. The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended.
If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them. Mr. 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐿.
Monsieur le Président, on m'a demandé de vérifier que mon vote a été
Mr. Speaker, I was asked to check whether my vote against was recorded. Yes, the vote against was recorded.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I vote nay.
I believe
you're on mute, Mr. Sheehan. No, we heard it.
Oh.
Mr. Sheehan, nay contre.
Okay, seeing no more, the table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 109, 109. Nays contre 209, 209.
I declare the amendment defeated. The next question is on the main motion. La question.
The question is as follows. Mr. Mendicino, seconded by Mrs. Fortier, moved that Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, firearms, be now read a third time and do pass.
If a member of a recognized party in the House wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division or wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair. The Honourable Member for Charles 1.
I request a recorded division.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person.
All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Mr. 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐿.
Mr. 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐿.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. Blair.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Monsieur Duclos.
Monsieur Duclos.
Ms. Tassi.
Ms. Tassi.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Monsieur 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐿.
Monsieur 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐿.
Ms. 𝐥𝐿𝐿𝐻.
Ms. 𝐥𝐿𝐻.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Monsieur 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐿.
Monsieur 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐿.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Madame Bendayan.
Madame Bendayan.
Ms. Demoff. Mrs. Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Virani.
Mr. Virani.
Monsieur Fergus.
Mr. Fergus.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Monsieur 𝐿𝐵𝐿.
Monsieur 𝐿𝐵𝐿.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Van Couverden. Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mrs. Suds.
Ms. Suds.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Monsieur Zuberi.
Monsieur Zuberi.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Ali.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Mr. Collins, Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Mr. Collins, Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Mr. Koto.
Mr. Koto.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. Miao.
Mr. Miao.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Madame Normandin.
Madame Normandin.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Désilé.
Monsieur Désilé.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Gaudreau.
Madame Gaudreau.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Barcelot-Duval.
Monsieur Barcelot-Duval.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Saint-Clair Degagné.
Madame Saint-Clair Degagné.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Madame Desbiens,
Madame Desbiens,
Madame Berruet,
Madame Berube,
Mr. Massey,
Mr. Massey,
Mr. Backrack,
Mr. Backrack,
Mr. Blakey,
Mr. Blakey,
Ms. Kwan,
Ms. Kwan,
Mr. Garrison,
Mr. Garrison,
Ms. Idlout,
Ms. Idlout,
Mr. Johns,
Mr. Johns,
Mr. McGregor,
Mr. McGregor,
Madame Hughes,
Madame Hughes,
Ms. Zarillo,
Ms. Zarillo,
Ms. Mathyssen,
Ms. Mathyssen,
Mr. Desjardins,
Mr. Desjardins,
Mr. Morris,
Mr. Morris.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Bezan,
Mr. Bezan.
Mr. 𝐒𝐿𝐿,
Mr. 𝐒𝐿𝐿.
Monsieur Deltel,
Monsieur Deltel.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk,
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Strahl,
Mr. Strahl.
Ms. Dancho,
Dancho.
Mr. Barlow, Mrs. Gray, Mr. Moore,
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Baldinelli,
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Mazer,
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Lewis Essex,
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Seaback,
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Small,
Mr. Small.
Mr. Ellis,
Mr. Ellis.
Monsieur Berthold,
Monsieur Berthold.
Mrs. Stubbs,
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Tucker,
Mr. Tucker.
Ms. Findley,
Ms. Findley.
Mr. Chong,
Mr. Chong.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman,
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Ms. Ferrari,
Ms. Ferrari.
Mr. Schmale,
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Vidal,
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Perkins,
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Davidson,
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Kelly,
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Viss,
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Cooper,
Mr. Cooper.
Monsieur Martel,
Mr. Martel.
Mrs. Roberts,
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Morantz,
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Melillo,
Mr. Melillo.
Mr. Van Popta,
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Lobb,
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Kitchen,
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse,
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott,
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Waugh,
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley,
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Lawrence,
Mr. Moore. Lawrence.
Monsieur Lou,
Monsieur Lou.
Mr. Cram,
Mr. Cram.
Mrs. Wagenthal,
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Currick,
Mr. Currick.
Mr. Carey,
Mr. Carey.
Mr. McLean,
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Patzer,
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West,
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Monsieur d'Entremont,
Monsieur d'Entremont.
Mr. Morrison,
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Bragdon,
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Soroka,
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Ruff,
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Shields,
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming proceedings. announce that the electronic voting period has ended. Si des députés n'ont pas pu voter en raison de problèmes techniques, ils peuvent maintenant activer.
If members were unable to vote because of technical problems.
If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
Mr. Sheehan.
Monsieur President.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for.
Mr. Sheehan, yea pour.
Seeing no more, the table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour, 207, 207. Nays contre, 113, 113.
I declare the motion carried. And the honourable member for London, Fanshawe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's in relation to the past vote that just occurred. Apparently, there were two members who voted with their app, but no photo appeared. So we would like clarification on how that is ruled in terms of the validity of their vote, just for future context as well. But it was the member for Fredericton and the member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
In consulting with the table, normally it has to be brought up before the results are announced. So, I mean, it's just, that's why the whips have the information, and they're supposed to get back to us with that. But what we're going to do is look into it and find out exactly what was there. But in future, if someone's photo was not clear, I would ask them to bring it up as soon as we stop, because once I stop, I'll ask if there was any well, we usually go to the next step, which is asking for the results of the vote, and that's normally when it would be brought up during question period, or during the vote. Okay, let's go.
Avec les règles.
With the current rules, a period where it's possible for each whip to signal to the chair and to signal to the House the problems that have come up during the vote. So those problems should have been raised during the period when you asked members if there were problems during the vote. I think the rules are very clear on that. Thank you. You said it much more eloquently than I did. Thank you very much.
And now another point of order. The honourable member for Grey Bruce. You're on, Bruce. I was close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't bring points of order up very often, but I just had a phone call from the member from Prince George, Peace River, and the Northern Rockies, and there was a little confusion about his vote, I guess, with the picture not coming up on his mobile app, but he's in his riding, and he's participating in the fires that are up there, and so I think it's already clear how his vote was recorded as a no, but just a little context as to why it maybe was a bit of a problem in his geography.
Yeah, we already said that we would look into it, and we'll get back to the House with some kind of an answer on that. Very good.
Perfect.